Constructive Beekeeping by Ed Clark. Section 3. One of the byproducts given off by the bees in ripening honey is water vapor. Sometimes more than 1 pound of water is expelled from the honey in part of a night. This much water vapor at average hive temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit would fill to saturation over 600 standard hive bodies. Then, if the air entering the hive was absolutely dry, and that emerging from it at saturation, and the hive air completely changed in 1 minute, this amount of water vapor would pass out in about 10 hours. But we never have absolutely dry air, nor do we have all the air in the hive even near saturation, nor can the bees change all the air in the hive through an opening in the lower front in 1 minute. The bees could not get rid of a pound of water in this way in 24 hours. 1 pound of water evaporated during the night from the nectar brought in during the day would empty over 1,600 cells. These and ones vacated by hatching bees would keep well ahead of the queen. In handling bees, we are bound to give recognition and allowance for the storing and ripening of nectar between the stores of ripened honey and the brood. If the hive be so protected that a good working temperature can easily be maintained, the honey close around the brood nest is either moved to some outside comb or consumed by the bees and brood, leaving empty cells to store the nectar. Removal of the water from the nectar is something to which the beekeeper has given little attention, because it could not be seen, but nevertheless we have the water vapor given off when the bees ripen a drop of honey in its mouth. We are as certain of it as we are of the wax scales that the bees secrete. We see the wax, but the water vapor, not being visible, has claimed little of our attention. The beekeeper, striving for good results, cannot afford to overlook the great part that water vapor plays in the hive. When the beekeeper opens the hive for inspection, does he ever observe the room available for the storage of a generous amount of nectar? He looks for queen cells, the amount of brood and sealed honey, and in this way he is conscious of what he calls plenty of room. While there is yet space between brood and honey, he concludes that the bees swarm before they are crowded for room. Did they ever have room to carry on all the work of the hive? Consider a farmer who has ample granary room to store his wheat, and who tried to put it in the granary before it was thrashed. It can be readily seen that the granary would not hold it. The bees must have temporary storage cells, just as the farmer must have sufficient room to stack his grain before it is thrashed. This is the room that the beekeeper has sensed, rather than to have observed it as room necessary for the domestic work of the bees. As the farmer must put aside the straw, so must the bees evaporate the water to get the finished honey that can be stored economically. How do the bees dispose of that great amount of water carried into the hive in the nectar? You say they evaporate it and it is carried off by the air. But is it? Try drying the family wash in a room of dimensions as regards to the water to be evaporated, temperature and opening at the floor, proportionate to the beehive, and see how fast your wash dries. Be sure you have no windows in the room to condensate the water vapor. Try it when the temperature outside is 60 degrees Fahrenheit and the atmosphere 1/2 saturated. 1/2 saturated in the evening is about as dry as we find the air in May and June, where there is ample rainfall. Then try it when the atmosphere is 9/10 saturated, and after this experience, you will be more amazed than ever at the bees' efficiency. Still, you are skeptical, and remember that you should have put an electric fan at the opening, because the bees are seen to fan at the entrance. Let us not delude ourselves about the bees moving all the water vapor given off in ripening honey out of the hive by fanning. Records of temperature and humidity taken from the U.S. Weather Station at Moorhead, Minnesota for 3 days at 7 p.m. are as follows. 1916. On May 13th, temperature is 45.5 degrees, humidity 93%. May 14th, 42.5 degrees, 100% humidity. May 15th, 37.5 degrees, 96% humidity. To remove from the hive 1 grain of water vapor by fanning on May 13th, the volume of air that would have had to have been moved would be 5 or 6 times the air capacity of the hive. To remove 1 pound of water would require the removal of a volume of air equal to the capacity of from 30,000 to 40,000 hive bodies. On May 14th, the outside air being saturated, no water vapor could be removed by a change of air, and on May 15th the result would be about the same. From this it can be readily seen that little water evaporation from the nectar could take place by ventilation, and we are led to believe that on such days as these the urge takes hold, giving swarms the last week of May. No contention will be raised when the statement is made that the water is evaporated from the honey before we have ripened honey. It has been taken for granted that as soon as the water passes off by evaporation, the bees were done with it. They would be if this evaporation took place the same as from the family wash hung on a line in open air. But if instead of having the great volume of moving outside air, we have in a standard hive body a little less than 1 cubic foot of air, where is all this water vapor going to go? But if instead of having the great volume of moving outside air, we have in a standard hive body a little less than 1 cubic foot of air, where is all this water vapor going to go? Saturate this small volume of air at hive temperature, and the water vapor in it would be from 1/600th to 1/5000th of what the bees evaporate in a night during a good honey flow. If they saturate this air in the hive and then force it out at the entrance, they would cause rain in the hive near the entrance. When hive conditions are as they should be, we must conclude that all the air in the hive is never near saturation. There is no known way of accurately measuring the humidity of the air inside the hive, but we can safely estimate that, except for a thin layer under the cover, it is never more than 3/4 saturated. We have then air entering the hive at a temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 1/2 saturation, which would, when heated to hive temperature, be about quarter saturated. This air, then, when heated to hive temperature, being quarter saturated, is capable of taking up moisture until it is 3/4 saturated. The amount of moisture taken up by this air is 3/4 minus 1/4 or half of its capacity at saturation. This amount of water vapor would be less than 1/1000th of a pound for a cubic foot of air. Now follow the course of this 90-degree air in passing from the hive by way of the entrance. As it approaches the entrance, the air temperature is reduced, and it would give up some of its water at the entrance. Could they force all the air out of the hive at the temperature of 90 degrees and fully saturated, each time the air in the hive is changed, 1/600th of a pound of water would be removed. A pound of water could be expelled from the hive in 10 hours if the bees could change all of the air of the hive once a minute. When an analysis of evaporation inside the hive is undertaken, we are confronted with many conditions that increase or retard it. Water vapor and warm air, being lighter than air at the entrance, pass naturally to the top of the hive and remain there unless a mechanical force compels them to move toward the entrance. This force is noticeable when the hive contains smoke. Under normal conditions, we do not find this fanning going on all through the hive. So far, only the evaporation which takes place when air and water are at the same temperature has been considered. Water can readily be turned into steam by boiling. This steam begins to rise from the surface of the water long before the water comes to the boiling point. Quote, "The surface of any watery liquid whose temperature is 20 degrees warmer than any superincumbent air rapidly gives off true steam." Unquote. Wells' Natural Philosophy. This applies to the evaporation in the hive. We know the temperature of the bee's body, and it naturally follows that the temperature of the nectar in the bee's stomach is the same. Observation tells us that the bees ripen the honey drop by drop, bringing it from the stomach and pulsating each drop in the mouth for about 10 minutes. The drop during this process is exposed to the air at a particular temperature of that part of the hive where the bee is doing this work. When this temperature is 20 degrees colder than the drop of nectar, true steam is given off. This evaporation takes place no matter how much water vapor is in the air, and varies with the difference of the temperature of the air surrounding the drop of nectar. This is forced evaporation. We find conditions favorable to forced evaporation in cool night temperatures and a hive with a generous around of room. To clearly comprehend the great amount of water that must be evaporated to get a pound of ripened honey, let us assume that 12 pounds is the weight of 1 gallon of honey, and 48 pounds the weight of 6 gallons of water. 6 gallons of water mixed with 1 gallon of honey gives 60 pounds of water and honey. 20% of ripened honey is water. 20% of 12 pounds, or 1 gallon of honey is 2.4 pounds. 48 pounds plus 2.4 pounds is 50.4 pounds, which is the weight of water in this mixture. 50.4 pounds is 84% of 60 pounds. 84% is a conservative estimate of the amount of water in nectar. To get 1 gallon of honey, 48 pounds of water must be separated from the nectar. To get 1 pound, 1/12 of 48 pounds of water must be separated, or 4 pounds. Let us grant that 2 pounds of this water is disposed of before the bees enter the hive. They will still have 2 pounds of water to evaporate before they produce 1 pound of ripened honey. When the honey increase of a hive is 4 pounds a day, 8 pounds of water must be evaporated. The nectar carried into the hive that day would require about 3 frames for temporary storage. When conditions are such as to hamper evaporation for 2 or 3 days of successful honey gathering, it can readily be seen that a crowded condition could exist. Nectar in flowers. Another way that evaporation influences the work of the bees is that which takes place from the surface of the nectar while it is yet in flower. Very little is known of the exact percentage of water in nectar. It has been weighed and found range from 60% to 93%. Scientists can never give us much information on this unless they take into account the evaporation which takes place from the surface of the nectar in the open flowers. Nectar in the same blossom may contain 90% of water at 9 a.m. and 60% at 2 p.m. because of the movement of air, sunshine, and low relative humidity. Because of this variation of the volume of water in nectar, we can understand what a difference there would be in hive conditions as the nectar is gathered at a time when there is little or much evaporation taking place in the field. Consider the gathering of nectar from buckwheat. There are districts where the bees work wholly on buckwheat during its blooming season, and peculiarities of the flow of this nectar have been commented on by many beekeepers. Some have noted that the nectar has all disappeared about 2 p.m. They have not gone so far as to prove this by examination of the flowers, but have assumed it to be so because the bees did not work on the flowers after this hour. This reasoning is right as to the absence of nectar after this hour. Other things commented on are that the bees gather honey from buckwheat only during sunshine periods, and that they gather more on a still day than a windy one. Let us now assume that all the blossoms that receive the direct rays of the sun secrete nectar suitable for the bees. We have no reason to doubt that flowers on the same plant, surrounded by like conditions, viz., sunshine and air, secrete nectar that the bees can gather. The bees cannot gather all the nectar from every flower which contains it before 2 p.m. It is not reasonable to believe that the flower absorbs what the bees don't gather by this time, and yet we know that it has disappeared. The only way to explain this absence of the nectar after this hour is that it has evaporated. Note the statement that the wind reduces the amount of honey gathered. Wind increases evaporation. Unless some close observer along this line can prove otherwise, we must reason that the flower containing nectar in the morning, and if this nectar has not been removed by any insect, it would still contain nectar in the afternoon so that the bees could gather it, if evaporation had not reduced it to such a consistency as to be useless to the bees. Absorption of water by honey. It would be impossible for the bees, except under the most favorable conditions as regards humidity of the air, to produce well-ripened honey wholly by evaporation, and depending on ventilation alone to carry off the water vapor. Honey put up in barrels that are not dry absorb water from the wood, shrinking it enough to cause leakage. One of the causes of watery cappings is that the honey has absorbed water from the moisture-laden air. Even if the bees ripened all the honey by some process within themselves, as some have suggested, this would have to allow for only worker bees doing the ripening and throwing off the water in flight from the hive. The moisture-laden air would soon undo the work of the bees. Hence, to produce well-ripened honey, we have to let the bees condense the moisture of the hive on the inside walls and ceilings. An exception of this would be in localities having a very dry atmosphere, but these are very scarce during the urge period. End of section 3.